Park Jinu wiped sweat from his forehead as he sat across from the Valdori delegation. 3 months into his first real assignment as a trade negotiator, and he was already messing things up. The alien beings looked like living crystal sculptures, their translucent blue skin catching the light from the conference room's overhead panels. When they moved, tiny chimes seemed to echo from within their bodies. "The mining rights to Sector 7 are non-negotiable," Jinu said, reading directly from his prepared notes. He thought he was being firm and professional. What he didn't know was that among the Valdori, discussing mining without first acknowledging their ancestral spirits was like spitting on someone's grave. The lead Valdori delegate, a towering figure, named High Commander Talvek, slowly stood up. The musical chiming from his crystalline body shifted to a lower, more ominous tone. The other 2 Valdori at the table stepped back, their faces showing something Jinu had never seen before: genuine fear. "You dare speak of taking from the sacred earth without honoring those who came before?" Talvek's voice carried a strange harmonic quality that made Jinu's teeth ache. "Human, you have insulted not just our delegation, but our entire bloodline, stretching back 10,000 years. Jinu blinked rapidly, his mind racing through his cultural briefing materials. Had he missed something important? I'm sorry if I said something wrong. Could we maybe start over?" The other humans in the room, his supervisor and 2 senior diplomats, had gone completely pale. His supervisor was frantically tapping something into her tablet, probably looking up Valdori customs that should have been memorized weeks ago. "There is no starting over," Talvek announced, his crystal skin now glowing with an angry red light. "By the ancient laws of our empire, you must face our champion in ritual combat. Only through blood can honor be restored." Jinu's mouth went dry. "Combat? But I'm just a negotiator. I don't even know how to fight properly. That is not our concern." Talvek gestured to the massive doors at the end of the conference room. They slid open with a grinding sound, and something enormous stepped through. Morthak the Iron Fist lived up to his name. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his crystalline body was a deep, dark red that looked almost black in certain light. His arms were thick as tree trunks, and his hands had been surgically replaced with actual metal gauntlets that were permanently fused to his bones. He had never lost a ritual combat in over 30 years. "This is insane," Jinu whispered to his supervisor. "Can't we just apologize and pay a fine or something?" She shook her head grimly. "I'm reading the cultural notes now. Refusing ritual combat is considered an act of war by their entire species. We're talking about potentially millions of lives." The combat arena was hastily prepared in the ship's cargo bay. Word had spread quickly through both the human and Valdori. Crews and a crowd gathered to watch what everyone assumed would be a very short fight. Jinu was given basic protective gear and a simple metal staff, traditional weapons according to Valdori custom. Morthak entered the makeshift ring without any protective gear at all. His metal fists caught the light as he flexed his fingers, creating sparks. The crowd fell silent as Talvek raised his hand to begin the ceremony. "Let honor be restored through combat," the High Commander announced. "Begin," Jinu had expected, to die quickly and hopefully painlessly. What he hadn't expected was how completely confused Morthak would become when faced with human fighting techniques. Where Valdori combat was all about strength, honor, and predictable patterns, Jinu fought like someone who had learned everything from old Earth movies and playground scuffles. He rolled between Morthak's legs, poked him in sensitive spots, threw dirt in his eyes, and generally fought in ways that the Valdori champion had never encountered in decades of ritual combat. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't honorable, but it was effective. The end came when Morthak, frustrated and half-blind from dirt, swung wildly at where he thought Jinu was standing. Instead, he lost his balance and fell hard onto the metal deck. The sound of cracking crystal filled the arena as his head struck the floor at just the wrong angle. The great champion of the Valdori Empire was dead, killed by a nervous trade negotiator who had never won a real fight in his life. The silence that followed was deafening. The cargo bay remained dead silent for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Jinu stood over Morthak's still body, the metal staff trembling in his hands. He couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment he was trying not to die, and the next moment the most feared warrior in the Valdori Empire was lying motionless on the cold deck. Then the whispers started. The Valdori and the crowd began speaking in their musical language, their voices creating an eerie harmony that sent chills down Jinu's spine. Some of them were backing away from the combat area, while others pressed closer, their crystalline faces showing expressions he couldn't read. An elderly Valdori female stepped forward from the crowd. Unlike the others, her crystal skin had a golden tint that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The intricate robes she wore marked her as someone important, very important. The other Valdori immediately bowed when they saw her approaching. "I am High Priestess Zalimar," she announced, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the cargo bay stand straighter. "Keeper of the ancient laws and guardian of our most sacred traditions." Jinu's supervisor quickly stepped beside him and whispered urgently, "She's like their Supreme Court judge and religious leader rolled into one. Whatever she says is absolute law." The High Priestess walked slowly around Morthak's body, examining it from different angles. She nodded to herself as if confirming something important. Then she turned to face Jinu directly, her golden eyes seeming to look right through him. "By defeating our champion in honorable combat, you have proven yourself worthy in the eyes of our ancestors," she declared. "According to the laws that have governed our people for over 10,000 years, everything that belonged to Morthak now belongs to you." Jinu felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Perhaps the champion had some valuable possessions or property that could help smooth over the diplomatic mess he'd created. "That includes," Zalimar continued, "his 3 wives." The relief disappeared instantly, replaced by a cold knot of panic in Jinu's stomach. "His what now?" "His wives," the High Priestess repeated calmly. "Kira the Blade Singer, Nava the Mind Weaver, and Yuna the Spirit Caller. They are now bound to serve you as they served him." From somewhere in the crowd, 3 Valdori females stepped forward. Even among their own people, they stood out as exceptional. The first one, who must be Kira, moved like a predator. Her crystal skin had a sharp, angular quality, and the way she carried herself screamed danger. Her eyes, when they fixed on Jinu, held barely controlled fury. Nava appeared more delicate, but there was something unsettling about the way she studied him, like a scientist examining a particularly interesting bug. Her skin had an almost transparent quality, and Jinu could swear he saw patterns of light moving beneath its surface as she thought. The third, Yuna, was the youngest looking of the 3. Her crystal skin had a soft, pearl-like shimmer, and she wore robes similar to the High Priestess, but much simpler. She looked at Jinu with what might have been curiosity, but it was hard to tell with alien facial expressions. "Wait, Jinu said, holding up his hands. "I can't take someone's wives. That's not how humans do things. We don't own people." A collective gasp went up from the Valdori crowd. Zalimar's golden glow seemed to dim slightly, and her expression became very serious. "You would refuse the inheritance?" she asked quietly. Jinu's supervisor grabbed his arm so hard it hurt. "Jinu, don't answer that yet," she whispered frantically while typing on her tablet. A few seconds later, her face went completely white. "Oh no. Oh no. "What?" Jinu demanded. "According to their law, refusing an inheritance from a defeated champion is the worst possible insult. It means you consider their entire culture worthless." She looked up from her tablet with terrified eyes. "It's grounds for immediate war against the entire Valdori Empire." Jinu looked around the cargo bay. The Valdori crowd was watching him intently, waiting for his answer. The 3 women, his supposed wives, stood perfectly still, but he could feel the tension radiating from them like heat from a fire. "How many ships does the Valdori Empire have?" he asked quietly. "Over 50,000, his supervisor whispered back, "including battle cruisers that could destroy entire planets." Jinu closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he looked directly at the High Priestess. "I accept the inheritance," he said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Zalimar nodded approvingly, and the tension in the room eased slightly. But when Jinu looked at his 3 new wives, he saw something in their expressions that made his stomach twist with worry. They weren't happy about this arrangement either, and something told him they were going to make sure he knew it. The quarters assigned to Jinnu were much larger than his previous cabin, but they felt more like a prison than an upgrade. The Valdori had quickly rearranged the space to accommodate 4 people, though calling it accommodation was generous. 3 additional sleeping alcoves had been carved into the walls, each one customized for its occupant. Jinnu sat on his bed, staring at the small pile of belongings that had belonged to Morthak. Most of it was incomprehensible, crystal formations that hummed with energy, weapons he couldn't even lift properly, and what looked like trophies from dozens of victories. The weight of inheriting another person's entire life pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. The door chimed, and Kira stepped inside without waiting for permission. She'd changed from her formal robes into something that looked like armor made of flexible crystal plates. In her hands, she carried 2 curved swords that seemed to sing as they moved through the air. "Time for morning combat practice," she announced, tossing one of the swords toward Jinnu. He barely caught it, nearly cutting himself on the impossibly sharp edge. Combat practice. It's barely been 6 hours since the fight with Morthak. Morthak, trained every day for 30 years without exception, Kira said, settling into a fighting stance that made her look like a coiled spring ready to explode. "If you wish to be worthy of taking his place, you will do the same." The sword felt clumsy and wrong in Jinnu's hands. It was too heavy in some places, too light in others, and the balance was completely different from the simple staff he'd used. In the cargo bay, when Kira attacked, he managed to block her first strike purely by accident. Her second strike knocked the weapon from his hands entirely. "Pathetic," she muttered, lowering her sword. Again. They repeated this pattern for an hour. Kira would attack, Jinnu would fail to defend properly, and she would express her disappointment in increasingly creative ways. By the end of the session, he had small cuts on his arms and a growing certainty that she was holding back only because the law required her to keep him alive. "Tomorrow, we train for 2 hours, Kira announced as she collected the swords. "If you show no improvement, we increase it to 3. She left without another word, and Jinnu collapsed onto his bed exhausted. He'd barely closed his eyes when the door chimed again. This time it was Nava, carrying what looked like a floating holographic puzzle made of interlocking geometric shapes. The patterns hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed for eyes. That could process light differently than human ones. "Intellectual assessment time," she said in a tone that suggested she expected very little from him. "Morthak could solve this configuration puzzle in under 10 minutes. Let's see how long it takes his replacement." Jinnu stared at the floating shapes, trying to understand how they were supposed to connect. Every time he thought he saw a pattern, the pieces would shift slightly, revealing new complexities. After 20 minutes of frustrated attempts, he'd managed to connect exactly 3 pieces out of what looked like several hundred. "Interesting," Nava mused, making notes on a crystal tablet. "Your mind processes information in a completely linear fashion. How do you manage to operate starships with such limited cognitive capacity?" "We do just fine, thank you," Jinnu replied, trying not to let his irritation show. "Clearly not, since you accidentally started a diplomatic incident that nearly led to war." She waved her hand, and the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves into a perfect sphere in seconds. "We'll continue this tomorrow, perhaps with simpler exercises more suited to your abilities." After she left, Jinnu had maybe an hour of peace before Yuna appeared. She moved so quietly that he didn't notice her until she was already setting up some kind of altar in the corner of his room. Dozens of small crystal formations were arranged in precise patterns, and she'd lit what smelled like incense, but looked like glowing sand. "Evening devotions," she explained without looking at him. Morthak always participated in the ritual honoring of the ancestor spirits. She began chanting in the musical Valdori language, her voice creating harmonies with the crystal formations. That filled the room with ethereal sound. After a few minutes, she paused and looked at him expectantly. "Well," she said. "Well what?" The responsive chant. Surely even humans have some way of showing respect to those who came before. Jinnu had no idea what she was talking about. He tried humming along with her melody, But apparently that was completely wrong, judging by the way her crystal skin darkened with embarrassment. "Never mind," she said quietly, extinguishing the glowing sand. "Perhaps tomorrow you'll be more prepared." As the days passed, the pattern continued. Kira would beat him in combat training, expressing growing frustration with his lack of natural fighting ability. Nava would present him with increasingly complex mental challenges that he couldn't even begin to understand, let alone solve. Yuna would attempt to include him in religious ceremonies that seemed to require knowledge he didn't possess. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the mental strain, it was the way they looked at him, not with hatred exactly, but with a kind of disappointed resignation. They'd been bound to a great warrior, a champion who had earned respect throughout their empire. Now they were stuck with a clumsy human who couldn't fight, couldn't think properly, and didn't even know how to pray correctly. Jinnu began to realize that surviving Morthak had been the easy part. Living up to his legacy might actually be impossible. The challenges started small. A young Valdori warrior named Kethron approached Jinnu in the ship's common area during his third week as Morthak's heir. The crystalline alien was barely out of adolescence by Valdori standards, his skin still showing the pale blue tint of youth rather than the deeper colors of maturity. "I claim the right of succession challenge," Kethron announced loudly, making sure everyone in the area could hear him. "The human got lucky once. Let's see how he handles a real warrior." Jinnu nearly choked on his meal. "Can't we just talk about this? Maybe arm wrestle instead?" The laughter from the surrounding Valdori was not encouraging. Within an hour, word had spread throughout both ships, and another combat arena was hastily prepared. This time Jinnu noticed the crowd was much larger and far more excited. They smelled blood in the water. Kethron was faster than Morthak had been, but less experienced. He relied too heavily on textbook moves that Jinnu could see coming from a mile away. The fight ended when Jinnu accidentally tripped the young warrior, sending him tumbling into the arena wall. It was embarrassing rather than deadly, but it counted as a victory. "Pure luck," muttered an older Valdori from the crowd. "Won't happen twice." But it did happen twice and 3 times and 4. Word spread beyond their ships to other Valdori vessels in the sector. Soon Jinnu found himself facing challenges every few days from warriors who traveled specifically to test themselves against the human who had killed their greatest champion. Each opponent was more dangerous than the last. They'd watched recordings of his previous fights, studied his unconventional tactics, and adapted their strategies accordingly. The 5th challenger, a scarred veteran named Torvax, nearly took Jinnu's head off with a move that perfectly countered the rolling maneuver that had saved him in previous fights. "You're learning their tricks," Kira observed, after watching Jinnu limp back to his quarters with a dislocated shoulder. "But they're learning yours faster." The 6th challenger was a problem. Commander Velthar had served in the Valdori military for over 20 years and had studied human combat footage from previous conflicts. He knew exactly how humans fought when they were desperate, and he'd prepared counters for everything. The fight started badly and got worse. Velthar systematically dismantled every technique Jinnu tried to use, staying just out of reach while landing precise strikes that gradually wore him down. By the halfway point, Jinnu was bleeding from a dozen small cuts and struggling to stay on his feet. That's when he noticed something odd. His sword felt different, sharper somehow, with better balance than he remembered. When he swung it, the blade cut through Velthar's guard like it was made of paper instead of crystal-hard alien hide. Then his reflexes kicked in with impossible speed. Velthar's next attack should have been too fast to dodge, but somehow Jinnu found himself moving out of the way before he'd even consciously seen the strike coming. His counterattack landed with precision that surprised even him. The fight ended when Jinnu's blade found a gap in Velthar's defense that he definitely hadn't seen a moment before. The commander went down hard, and the crowd erupted in confused cheering. Back in his quarters, Jinnu examined his sword carefully. It looked exactly the same as always, but something was definitely different. The edge seemed impossibly sharp, and there were tiny markings near the hilt that he was sure hadn't been there before. "Enjoying your victories?" Nava asked from the doorway. She'd been watching him examine the weapon with an expression he couldn't read. "Something's not right," Jinnu said. This sword has been modified somehow, and during the fight I moved faster than I should have been able to. Perhaps you're finally developing proper warrior instincts, she replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was saying. The 7th challenger arrived 3 days later. Gorthel the Bonebreaker lived up to his name. He was massive even by Valdori standards, with dark red crystal skin that looked like it had been forged in fire. He'd killed 17 opponents in ritual combat and had never been defeated. This fight should have been Jinu's last. Gorthel was stronger, faster, and more experienced than any previous opponent. But again, Jinu found himself moving with impossible precision. His sword seemed to guide itself to weak points in the giant's defense. Even more strangely, he felt energized rather than tired, as if something was sustaining his strength throughout the battle. The killing blow came when Gorthel overextended himself trying to crush Jinu with both fists. Instead of being there to receive the attack, Jinu found himself behind the giant, his sword sliding between crystal plates with surgical precision. As Gorthel fell, Jinu caught a glimpse of movement in the crowd. 3 figures were backing away from the arena, trying not to be noticed. His 3 wives, all wearing expressions of carefully controlled neutrality. That night, Jinu lay awake staring at the ceiling. Someone had been helping him survive these challenges, and he was starting to suspect he knew who. The question was, why? Were they protecting their investment, or was something else going on? Outside his door, he could hear quiet voices speaking in the Valdori language. The conversation was too soft to make out words, but the tone sounded like people discussing a secret they weren't ready to share. More challenges would come. They always did. But now Jinu was beginning to realize that he might not be facing them. Alone after all, Jinu couldn't sleep. For the 3rd night in a row, he lay staring at the ceiling of his quarters, replaying the fight with Gorthel in his mind. Something about that victory felt wrong, not just lucky, but impossible. He'd moved faster than any human should be able to move, and his sword had found weak spots that he couldn't have known existed. Finally, giving up on sleep, he quietly slipped out of bed and padded toward the small kitchenette area. Maybe some warm tea would help calm his racing thoughts. As he reached for the food processor, his foot knocked against something hard on the floor. It was a small crystal vial, barely the size of his thumb, hidden behind the storage unit. The liquid inside glowed with a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Jinu held it up to the light, squinting at the alien markings etched into the glass. "That's a Valdori combat enhancer," a voice said behind him. Jinu spun around, nearly dropping the vial. Nava stood in the doorway, no longer bothering to hide her presence. In the dim light, her translucent skin seemed to glow from within, patterns of light moving beneath the surface like slow lightning. "You've been drugging my food," Jinu said. It wasn't a question. "Among other things," she replied, stepping into the room. "Though drugging is such an ugly human word, I prefer biochemical optimization." "What other things?" Before Nava could answer, another figure emerged from the shadows. Kira moved like a ghost, her crystal skin darkened to almost black, apparently something Valdori could do when they wanted to remain unseen. In her hands she carried what looked like microscopic tools and a small device that Jinu recognized as belonging to his latest challenger. "I've been adjusting their equipment," Kira said simply. "Dulling blade edges, weakening armor joints, sometimes adding tiny flaws that would cause weapons to break at crucial moments." Jinu felt his legs go weak. He sank into a chair, staring at both women. "You've been cheating. All this time I thought I was actually getting better at fighting, but you've been sabotaging my opponents." "Not cheating," a third voice corrected, gently. Yuna stepped out from behind the sleeping alcoves, her pearl-like skin shimmering in the low light. "Protecting, there's a difference." "Is there?" Jinu demanded. "I've been living a lie. Every victory, every moment I thought I was proving myself worthy. It was all fake." The 3 women exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Kira spoke. "Sit down," she said. "There are things you need to understand about Morthak. Things we've never told anyone." Jinu was already sitting, but he settled deeper into his chair, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. "Morthak wasn't just a champion," Nava began. her voice losing its usual intellectual detachment. "He was a monster. For 15 years we lived under his rule, and every day brought new cruelties." "He beat us regularly," Kira added, her crystal skin flickering between colors as emotions played across her features. "Not in combat training. That would have been acceptable. He beat us for entertainment, for minor mistakes, sometimes just because he was bored. He forbade us from speaking to each other without his permission," Yuna said quietly. "For 3 years I wasn't allowed to perform religious ceremonies because he decided our gods were weak and useless, like us." Jinu felt sick. "Why didn't you leave him? Couldn't you have asked for help?" "Leave?" Kira laughed bitterly. "We were his property, bound by law and sacred vows. The only way out was if he died in combat or chose to release us, and Morthak never lost a fight." "Until you," Nava said, looking directly at Jinu. A nervous human diplomat who had never held a weapon in his life somehow defeated the greatest warrior in our empire. "We thought it was impossible," Yuna added. "But then we watched you these past weeks. The way you treat us, asking our opinions, saying please and thank you, never raising your voice in anger. We'd forgotten that such behavior was possible." Jinu rubbed his temples, trying to process everything they were telling him. "So you started helping me in fights because we realized something," Kira interrupted. "For the first time in 15 years, we weren't afraid. You never threatened us, never demanded things from us, never used your legal authority over us to hurt us." "We're still bound to serve you by law," Nava explained, "but we choose to protect you because you're different. You lead by example instead of fear. Your way is strange to us," Yuna admitted, "but it's also peaceful. When you failed at our tests, you didn't punish us for making you look weak. When you couldn't understand our religious ceremonies, you asked questions instead of declaring them forbidden." Jinu sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing their words. Finally, he looked up at the 3 women who had been secretly keeping him alive. "I'm not a leader," he said. "I'm just a guy who got in way over his head and has been trying not to drown." "That's exactly why we help you," Kira replied. "Morthak always claimed he was perfect, that he deserved absolute power because he was superior to everyone else. You admit your weaknesses and ask for help. That takes a different kind of strength." "What happens now?" Jinu asked. The 3 women looked at each other again, another silent conversation passing between them. "Now," Nava said, "we tell you about the real threat. The challenges from individual warriors were just the beginning. There are forces within the Valdori military who want you dead for political reasons, and they're planning something that our small deceptions won't be able to stop." Jinu closed his eyes and sighed deeply. Just when he thought he understood his situation, it got more complicated. "All right," he said, opening his eyes. "Tell me everything." The next morning, Nava spread out what looked like a 3-dimensional map made of light across Jinu's small table. The holographic display showed star systems, ship movements, and communication networks throughout Valdori space. Red dots pulsed ominously at several key locations. "We've been monitoring military communications for weeks," she explained, manipulating the display with graceful hand movements. "What we found is disturbing." Jinu leaned forward, trying to make sense of the alien symbols and patterns. "I can't read any of this. What am I looking at?" "War preparations," Kira said grimly. She pointed to clusters of red dots near the edge of human space. "Fleet movements, weapon stockpiles and training exercises, all disguised as routine activities, but the pattern is clear to anyone who knows how to look. General Vektar has been building support among the military for months," Yuna added, her voice barely above a whisper. "He believes the Valdori Empire has grown weak through diplomacy and trade agreements. He wants to return to the old ways, conquest and expansion." Nava touched one of the red dots, and the display zoomed in to show detailed ship schematics. "But he needs justification for attacking humanity. The civilian government would never approve an unprovoked war, and most of our people are tired of fighting after centuries of conflict." "So where do I fit into this?" Jinu asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "You're perfect for his needs," Kira explained, "a human who defeated our greatest champion and inherited his wives. It makes you a symbol of human dominance over Valdori culture." If you were to die under suspicious circumstances, he could claim we murdered you through treachery, Jinu finished, and use that as an excuse to start a war. Exactly. Nava manipulated the display again, showing communication intercepts. We've been tracking his messages to various military commanders. He's been promising them glory, conquest, and revenge against the weak humans who dare to negotiate with us as equals. Jinu felt a chill run down his spine. How many people are we talking about? How big is this conspiracy? At least 30 high-ranking officers across 12 battle fleets, Yuna said quietly. Maybe more. Vectar has been very careful to only approach those he knows share his views. The holographic display shifted to show what looked like a massive warship, larger than anything Jinu had ever seen. Its hull bristled with weapons, and the energy readings made the numbers on human ships look like toys in comparison. The Eternal. Vengeance, Kira said. Vectar's flagship. He's been using it to visit loyal commanders throughout the Empire, building his network of supporters. And he's bringing a special champion with him, Nava added. Someone whose identity is being kept secret, even from most of his own officers. Jinu studied the ship's specifications, his heart sinking as he realized the scale of what they were facing. This isn't just about me anymore, is it? If he succeeds in starting this war, millions of people could die. Billions, Yuna corrected softly. Both species have vast populations spread across hundreds of worlds. A full-scale war between our peoples would be catastrophic. Why are you telling me this? Jinu asked, looking at each of his wives in turn. You could just let it happen. Let me die fighting this mystery champion, let the war start. Your people would probably win. The three women exchanged glances again, but this time Jinu could read the communication passing between them. It wasn't the careful neutrality he'd seen before, it was determination. Because we've seen what your species can do when you work together, Nava said. The way you humans adapt, innovate, and overcome impossible odds. A war between our peoples wouldn't have winners, only survivors. And because we've learned something important from watching you, Kira added. Strength isn't just about being able to defeat your enemies. Sometimes real strength means finding ways to avoid fighting in the first place. Morthak would have welcomed this war, Yuna said. He would have seen it as a chance for glory and conquest. But you're horrified by the idea of so much death and suffering. That tells us everything we need to know about the kind of leader you really are. Jinu sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were telling him. So what do we do? How do we stop a military conspiracy that spans multiple star systems? We start by gathering evidence, Nava said. Real proof of what Vectar is planning, something we can present to the civilian government and moderate military leaders. And we prepare for the fight that's coming, Kira added, because even if we expose the conspiracy, Vectar won't give up easily. He'll send his champion anyway, hoping to salvage his plans. We'll need to work together, Yuna said. Not as master and servants bound by law, but as partners fighting for something we all believe in. Jinu looked at the three women who had started as strangers, forced upon him by alien law. Now they were offering to help him prevent a war between their species, risking their own lives in the process. Partners, he said, extending his hand toward them. I like the sound of that. One by one, they clasped his hand with their own, their crystal skin warm against his human flesh. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Jinu felt like he might actually have a chance at success. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance, unaware that the fate of two entire civilizations might depend on what happened in the coming days. The training began at dawn the next day, in an unused cargo bay that Nava had converted into a practice arena. She'd somehow acquired proper Valdori training equipment, weighted practice weapons, holographic target systems, and padding that could absorb the impact of crystal-hard alien strikes without breaking human bones. Forget everything you think you know about combat, Kira announced as she handed Jinu a training sword. Valdori fighting is based on individual honor and strength. Human combat, from what I've observed, relies on adaptation and teamwork. We're going to combine both approaches. The first lesson was humbling. Jinu quickly discovered that his previous victories had relied heavily on luck and his wife's secret assistance. Without enhancement drugs in his system or sabotaged enemy equipment, he could barely keep up with Kira's slowest attacks. "Stop trying to match my strength," she said, after knocking him flat for the 10th time. "You'll never be as physically powerful as a Valdori warrior. Use your advantages instead." "What advantages?" Jinu gasped, picking himself up off the deck. "You think differently," Yuna explained from where she sat monitoring his vital signs on a crystal tablet. "Valdori combat follows traditional patterns that we learn from childhood. You have no patterns, which makes you unpredictable." "Also," Nava added, looking up from a complex holographic display she was building, "humans seem to have an unusual ability to learn from observation and adapt quickly to new situations." The training sessions became intense collaborative efforts. Kira would demonstrate traditional Valdori combat techniques, breaking them down into individual components. Jinu would then figure out ways to counter or redirect those techniques using human fighting principles, leverage, momentum, and misdirection rather than brute force. "Your species fights like water," Kira observed after watching Jinu successfully deflect one of her attacks by turning her own momentum against her. "You flow around obstacles instead of trying to smash through them." The breakthrough came during their second week of training. Jinu was sparring with all 3 women at once, something that should have been impossible given their superior speed and strength. But by constantly moving, using them as shields against each other and coordinating his attacks with their movements, he managed to last nearly 5 minutes before they overwhelmed him. "That's it," Nava said excitedly, her skin glowing brighter. As ideas sparked in her mind. "You're not fighting 3 opponents. You're fighting as part of a 4-person unit that happens to be on opposite sides." "What do you mean?" Jinu asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Watch this," Kira said. She nodded to her sisters, and suddenly all 3 women began moving in perfect coordination. Their attacks flowed together like a deadly dance, each one covering the other's weak points, while creating openings for devastating combination strikes. "Traditional Valdori group combat," Yuna explained, "but it only works when all fighters have similar training and fighting styles." "Now watch this," Jinu said. He'd been thinking about something during their sparring session. "What if instead of fighting against your coordination, I became part of it?" The next attempt was clumsy at first. Jinu kept trying to match their rhythm instead of finding his own place within it. But gradually something clicked. He stopped trying to fight like a Valdori warrior and started fighting like himself, but as part of their unit instead of against it. When Kira lunged forward, with a powerful strike, Jinu was there to guide her target into the path of Nava's follow-up attack. When Yuna created an opening with her defensive moves, Jinu filled it with an unconventional strike that none of them had seen coming. When all 3 women coordinated a finishing move, Jinu became the 4th part of their formation, turning their triangle into a diamond. "Incredible," Nava breathed when they finally stopped to rest. "I've never seen anything like it. You're not just adapting to our fighting style, you're helping us adapt to yours." While they trained their bodies, they also worked to gather evidence of General Vektar's conspiracy. Nava used her technical skills to slice into military communication networks, carefully copying messages and data files without leaving traces of their intrusion. Yuna used her religious connections to reach out to temple networks throughout Valdori space, gathering information about unusual military activities near sacred sites. Kira contacted old friends from her warrior training days, people who might have heard rumors about secret meetings or suspicious orders. The picture that emerged was even worse than they'd initially thought. Vektar wasn't just planning to use Jinu's death as an excuse for war. He was actively preparing for immediate invasion once the justification was in place. Troop movements, supply stockpiles, and fleet positions all pointed to a massive military campaign that could begin within days of the signal. "He's been planning this for months, maybe years," Nava said as she compiled their evidence into a comprehensive report. "The conspiracy goes deeper than we thought and involves more people than we initially estimated." "How many ships are we talking about?" Jinu asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "At least 15 battle fleets," Kira replied, grimly. "Maybe 20, enough to overwhelm human defenses before your people could mount an effective response. But we have proof now, Yuna said, gesturing to the glowing data crystals that contained their evidence. Messages, fleet movements, supply manifests, everything we need to expose the conspiracy to the civilian government. Jinnu picked up one of the data crystals, marveling at how something so small could contain information that might prevent a war. The question is, will they believe us? And will they act fast enough to stop what's already in motion? That depends, Nava said, on whether we can survive long enough to deliver this evidence to the right people. Through the viewport, they could see a massive Valdori warship approaching their position. The Eternal Vengeance had arrived, and with it, General Vectar's mysterious champion. The time for training was over. The real fight was about to begin. The arena had been prepared in the largest cargo bay of the station, with representatives from dozens of Valdori ships in attendance. Word had spread throughout the sector that General Vectar himself was bringing a champion to face the human who had killed Morthak. The crowd was larger than any Jinnu had seen before, their crystalline voices creating an ominous harmony as they discussed the upcoming battle. General Vectar stood at the edge of the combat area, his dark red crystal skin bearing the scars of countless battles. His uniform was covered with medals and honors from military campaigns spanning decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Citizens of the Valdori Empire," he announced, his words echoing through the bay. "Today we witness the restoration of our ancient honor. The human who dares to claim dominance over our greatest champion will face true Valdori strength." The champion who stepped into the arena made even Morthak look small by comparison. Gorthal the Destroyer stood nearly 9 feet tall, his crystal skin so dark it was almost black. His arms and legs had been surgically enhanced with metal reinforcements that gleamed like weapons in the arena lights. Most disturbing of all, his eyes had been replaced with glowing red crystals that tracked movement with mechanical precision. "He's been modified," Nava whispered from beside Jinnu. "Cybernetic enhancements, combat drugs, probably neural implants to increase reaction time. This isn't just a warrior, it's a living weapon." Jinnu felt his mouth go dry as he studied his opponent. "Can we actually beat something like that?" "Not if you fight him alone," Kira said quietly. "But we're not planning to fight him alone, are we?" The High Priestess Zalimar called for silence as she prepared to announce the terms of combat. But before she could speak, Jinnu stepped forward. "I invoke the right of unit combat," he declared, his voice carrying further than he'd expected. Confused murmur ran through the crowd. Even Zalimar looked puzzled. "Unit combat? That is not a recognized form of ritual challenge." "According to the ancient laws," Jinnu continued, hoping his weeks of studying Valdori legal texts would pay off, "any warrior may choose to face a challenge alongside those bound to him by marriage or blood, provided all parties consent." General Vectar's expression darkened. "This is nonsense. The human seeks to avoid honorable single combat through legal trickery." "The law is clear," Zalimar said, after consulting with other legal experts in the crowd. "If his wives consent to share the challenge, it is permitted." One by one, Kira, Nava, and Yuna stepped into the arena beside Jinnu. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people realized they were about to witness something that had never happened before in Valdori history. "This changes nothing," Vectar snarled. "Gorthal will destroy all 4 of them." The massive champion cracked his metal-reinforced knuckles, creating sparks that fell to the arena floor. "4 weaklings die as easily as 1, he rumbled in a voice like grinding stone. As the combat began, Jinnu activated a small device hidden in his equipment belt. Nava had designed it to broadcast on all Valdori communication frequencies, military, civilian, and religious networks. Throughout the Empire, anyone monitoring those channels would now receive the evidence they'd gathered about Vectar's conspiracy. Gorthal charged forward with terrifying speed, his enhanced muscles propelling him across the arena in seconds. But instead of meeting him head-on, the 4 fighters scattered in different directions, forcing the champion to choose a single target. He chose Jinnu, probably figuring the human was the weakest link. But as his massive fist swung down, Jinnu wasn't there anymore. He'd rolled between Gorthel's legs while Kira struck at the champion's knee from the side, causing him to stumble. The champion spun around, swinging wildly, but now Yuna was behind. Him! Her staff striking precisely at nerve clusters she'd memorized during their training. Gorthel roared in pain and anger, but his enhanced body was already adapting, rerouting neural pathways around the damaged areas. "He's learning our attack patterns," Nava called out as she dodged a massive backhand that would have taken her. "Head off. We need to stay unpredictable." That's when their weeks of training paid off. Instead of following preset formations, they began to improvise. Jinnu would start an attack that Kira would finish from a completely different angle. Yuna would create an opening that Nava would exploit with a move none of them had practiced. Their fighting style became fluid, organic, impossible to predict or counter. Gorthel was stronger, faster, and more durable than any of them individually, but he'd been programmed to fight single opponents or traditional Valdori formations. He couldn't adapt to their constantly changing tactics fast enough to counter them effectively. The end came when all four fighters coordinated a single, complex maneuver. Jinnu distracted Gorthel from the front, while Kira and Yuna attacked his legs from both sides, causing him to lose balance. As he fell, Nava was already in position above him, her weapon aimed precisely at the junction between his natural crystal skin and his cybernetic enhancements. The champion crashed to the arena floor and didn't get up. In the stunned silence that followed, Jinnu's broadcast device finished transmitting the evidence of Vekitar's conspiracy to every corner of the Valdori Empire. Military communications lit up with confused chatter as officers tried to understand what they were seeing and hearing. "Treachery!" Vektar screamed, drawing his own weapon. "The human uses forbidden technology to spread lies." But it was too late. High-ranking military officials throughout the Empire were already confirming the authenticity of the intercepted messages. The conspiracy was exposed, and with it, Vektar's dreams of war. As security forces moved to arrest the general, Jinnu looked around at his three wives, his partners, and realized they'd done something that seemed impossible just weeks ago. They'd prevented a war. The aftermath of General Vektar's arrest sent shockwaves throughout the Valdori Empire that continued for weeks. Communication networks buzzed with activity as the evidence Nava had compiled spread from ship to ship, world to world. Military commanders found themselves under investigation, civilian leaders demanded explanations, and the general population struggled to understand how close they'd come to a devastating war. Jinnu watched the political chaos unfold. From the conference room that had become his temporary office, reports flooded in hourly. Some military units had attempted to continue with Vektar's original plans before being stopped by loyal forces. 3 governors had been arrested for their involvement in the conspiracy, and the Valdori Senate had called an emergency session to address the crisis. 17 battle fleets, Nava reported, looking up from her data displays. That's how many were positioned for the invasion of human space. If we hadn't exposed this when we did, the war would have started within days. "What's happening to them now?" Jinnu asked. "Being recalled to their home ports for investigation," Kira replied. "The new military leadership wants to question every officer involved in the positioning orders." The political upheaval had created an unexpected opportunity. High Priestess Zalimar had requested a formal meeting to discuss what she called unprecedented legal developments arising from Jinnu's victory. When she arrived at their quarters, she brought with her a council of legal scholars whose crystal skin glowed with excitement. "Your combat victory has created a problem," she explained, settling into the chair they'd arranged for her. "A wonderful problem, but a problem nonetheless." "What kind of problem?" Jinnu asked, though he suspected he already knew where this was. "Heading, you and your wives fought as equals," one of the legal scholars interjected. "Not as a master commanding servants, but as partners working toward a common goal. This has never happened before in our recorded history." "The legal implications are staggering," another scholar added. "If marriage bonds can be based on mutual cooperation rather than hierarchical dominance, it changes everything about how we understand family structures, inheritance laws, and social organization." Zalimar raised a hand for silence. We've spent weeks debating this matter. The conclusion is that your victory has established a new legal precedent. Partnership marriages, unions based on equality rather than ownership, are now recognized under Valdori law. Jinu felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. So we're not actually married in the traditional sense anymore. You're married in a completely new sense, Yuna said quietly. If you want to be. The conversation that followed was the most awkward of Jinu's life. The legal scholars excused themselves, sensing that this was a discussion the four partners needed to have privately. Even Zalimar withdrew, promising to return later for their formal decision. So, Jinu said once they were alone, I guess we need to figure out what we actually want our relationship to be. The silence stretched for several minutes before Kira spoke. I've spent 15 years being owned by someone who saw me as property. The idea of choosing my own path is frightening, but also exciting, Nava added. For the first time in our lives, we can decide for ourselves what we want. The question is, Yuna said, looking directly at Jinu, what do you want? Jinu had been dreading this conversation, but now that it was happening, the answer came more easily than he'd expected. I want us to be partners, real partners, working together because we choose to, not because some law forces us to. Partners? In what sense? Kira asked. However we want to define it, Jinu replied. Political partners working together to prevent future conflicts between our species. Personal partners, supporting each other through whatever challenges come next. Maybe, eventually something more if that's what we all decide we want. Over the following days, their unusual situation attracted attention from the highest levels of both governments. The Human Diplomatic Corps offered Jinu a promotion to full ambassador status if he would agree to remain with the Valdori permanently. The Valdori civilian government formally requested that he serve as a cultural liaison, helping to bridge the gap between their peoples. The decision to accept was surprisingly easy. Earth needed someone who understood Valdori culture intimately, and the Valdori Empire needed voices of moderation to counter the military extremists who still believed in conquest over cooperation. Ambassador Park Jinu, Nava said, testing out the title. It has a nice sound to it. Ambassador and his 3 senior advisors, Kira corrected. We're all in this together now. Their new roles required them to travel throughout Valdori space, meeting with planetary governors, military commanders, and civilian leaders. Everywhere they went, their story had preceded them, the human who defeated their greatest champion and then chose partnership over dominance. Some Valdori were suspicious of the changes they represented. Others were curious about new ways of organizing relationships and society. But increasingly, especially among younger generations, they were seen as symbols of a different path forward. The romantic aspect of their relationship remained undefined, evolving slowly and naturally without pressure or expectations. Some days Jinu felt like he was living with 3 close friends and colleagues. Other days he caught glimpses of something deeper, shared glances, casual touches, moments of intimacy that suggested their partnership might become something more. We have time, Yuna said one evening, as they watched the stars from the observation deck of their diplomatic vessel. For the first time in any of our lives, we have time to figure out what we want, without anyone forcing decisions on us. 6 months after the failed conspiracy, they received word that the Valdori Senate had formally adopted new legislation recognizing partnership marriages throughout the empire. Thousands of couples had already chosen to restructure their relationships, based on equality rather than hierarchy. You realize what this means? Nava said, showing them the legislative report. We accidentally started a social revolution. Jinu laughed, remembering the terrified trade negotiator who had stumbled into ritual combat less than a year ago. I guess that's what happens when you combine human adaptability with Valdori determination. And partnership with equals, Kira added, raising her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, they said together. And for the first time since this whole adventure began, Jinu felt truly hopeful about what the future might bring.